There's a particular kind of silence that lives inside abandoned buildings. Not the silence of emptiness. That's something else entirely. Something hollow and indifferent. This is a silence with weight to it. A silence that knows things. It presses against your eardrums like water at depth, and if you stay still long enough, you start to believe the walls are holding their breath. I noticed it the moment I stepped through what remained of the Alden Theater's front doors. It was a Tuesday in early October, which in Manhattan means the light has turned that specific shade of amber that makes everything look like a memory of itself. Golden, slightly unreliable, already grieving its own passing. I had my canvas bag over one shoulder, a flashlight in my hand even though the late morning sun still pushed through the gaps in the boarded windows, and a folder of preliminary assessments pressed against my chest like a shield. I remember standing in the lobby for a long moment before I moved any further. The floor beneath me was marble, Botticino, I thought, or something close to it. Cracked in several places but still recognizable as something that had once been magnificent. Above, the original chandelier hung from a medallion of carved plasterwork, stripped of its crystals, the bare arms reaching outward like a figure frozen mid-gesture, asking for something it would never receive. The assessment I'd been handed described the Alden as a non-contributing structure with deterioration beyond cost-effective remediation, which is the kind of language people use when they don't want to say, "We've already decided. We've already decided, and now we need someone with credentials to sign the paperwork." I'd told myself I understood the assignment. I told myself that on the train, and then again while walking the last 2 blocks, and again at the door. I was a consultant. I evaluated properties. I wrote reports. I was not here to save anything. I was here to assess. My name is Larkin Halloway, and I have never once in my professional life managed to be purely objective about a building. The Alden had been built in 1927, designed by Emmett Ferris in a period when New York architects were collectively seized by an almost religious devotion to verticality and ornament. Art Deco wasn't just a style then, it was a philosophy, a belief system that held that beauty and industry were not opposites, that a city could ascend and, in ascending, become something sacred. Ferris had been a true believer. He'd embedded his faith in the Alden's bones, in the zigzag friezes above the proscenium arch, in the stylized floral motifs on the balcony railings, in the sunburst pattern on the ceiling that I could just make out behind 80 years of dust and neglect. The theater had seated 900 people at its peak. It had hosted vaudeville, opera, early jazz, a season of avant-garde theater in the 50s that had scandalized the times and filled every seat regardless. Then it had hosted a coat factory, then storage units, then nothing at all. I was halfway down the center aisle making notes when I heard the footsteps. They were deliberate. That was the first thing I registered. Not hurried, not exploratory, but deliberate in the way that belongs to people who move through spaces as though the spaces exist for their convenience. Heels on marble, a rhythm that didn't adjust for the debris on the floor, which meant whoever it was had either been here before or didn't intend to adjust for anything at all. I turned. Vespera St. Clair was not what I expected, which is a strange thing to say, because I hadn't really formed expectations beyond the professional biography I'd skimmed on the train. 51, third-generation real estate, the Saint. Clair Group's portfolio valued at somewhere north of $4 billion, known for large-scale redevelopment, a reputation in certain circles for being effective, and, in other circles, for being ruthless, which, in the real estate world, often amounts to the same description applied by different people. There had been a photo on the company website. Formal, distant, the particular expression of someone who has decided a photograph is a negotiation. The woman walking toward me through the ruins of the Alden Theater's center aisle bore some resemblance to that photograph in the way that a storm resembles the weather forecast that precedes it. Technically accurate and somehow entirely unprepared for. She was tall, with the kind of posture that reads as either discipline or armor, possibly both. Her hair was silver white, worn back in a style that was elegant without being fussy, the kind of arrangement that looks effortless and takes either excellent genes or 30 years of practice. She wore a coat the color of slate, well cut enough that it probably cost more than my rent, and she walked with her hands free. No bag, no folder, no props of any kind, which struck me even then as a kind of statement. She needed nothing. She brought herself, and herself was sufficient. She stopped about 6 feet from me and looked at me with gray eyes that were assessing and patient and somehow entirely unimpressed, not in the particular way of condescension, but in the more unsettling way of someone who has simply decided to wait and see. "Ms. Halloway," she said. It wasn't a question. "Ms. St. Clair." I extended my hand. She shook it, brief, firm, complete. "I wasn't expecting you today. Your office said the site walk would just be me and the building manager." The building manager called in sick. A pause that was not quite long enough to be a silence. I prefer to form my own impressions. "Of the building?" I said. She glanced around the theater with the expression of someone filing information. "Of the consultant." I wasn't sure whether I was meant to feel put on notice or complimented. The uncertainty was probably intentional. I turned back to my notes to give myself a moment and gestured toward the proscenium. "I've only just started, but from initial observation, the structural elements are in better condition than the survey suggested. The facade's load-bearing capacity should still be—" "I've read the survey," she said. "Of course. I've also read the counter-arguments from the Preservation Society, the historical designation filings from 2019, and the 3 separate assessments that concluded this building was worth saving. I found them optimistic." Something tightened in my chest. Not quite anger, more like the precursor to it, the gathering of it. Then why am I here? Because my attorney suggested an independent assessment would be useful before we proceed. She said it without apology and without explanation, which somehow made it worse and also, oddly, more honest than I'd anticipated. "I don't expect you to agree with my conclusions. I expect you to document the property's current condition accurately." "That's exactly what I intend to do." "Good." She looked at me again with that gray, patient regard. "Then we won't have a problem." She walked past me toward the stage, and I stood for a moment watching her navigate the debris without hesitation, stepping over a fallen section of railing, ducking slightly under a length of draped canvas that had come loose from something overhead. And I thought, she has been here before. She knows this space. Whatever she's decided about it, she didn't decide carelessly. I couldn't decide if that made it better or worse. We spent the next 3 hours in something that could charitably be called a working dynamic. Vespra St. Clair did not hover. She did not interfere. She moved through the Alden with a kind of contained self-sufficiency, examining things I pointed out with the expression of someone acknowledging information without being changed by it. When I crouched to check the condition of the subfloor beneath a section of warped boards near the orchestra pit, she crouched beside me, silk coat and all, and looked where I was looking, and said nothing until I explained what I was seeing. And then she asked a single precise question about remediation timelines and costs that told me she understood far more about construction than her biography implied. "You've done restoration work before," I said, not quite as a question. "My grandmother did." A brief pause. "She restored 2 brownstones on West 77th in the 70s. I watched." Another pause, and this one had something different in it. Not quite reflection, something closer to the act of deciding not to say more. "She believed in it, the restoring." "And you don't?" She looked at me. I believe in things that work. Plenty of restored historic buildings work. They generate revenue, they anchor neighborhoods, they... Ms. Holloway. Her voice was not unkind. It was simply final. I've had this conversation many times. It's a good conversation. But it's not why you're here. I went back to my measurements, but I kept thinking about what she'd said. Her grandmother, the brownstones, the watching. There had been something in her voice when she said it that didn't match the rest of her. A frequency slightly off from the surrounding material, like a patch in old plasterwork, detectable only at certain angles. By the time we reached the upper balcony, the afternoon light had shifted, coming in now through gaps in the roof at a lower angle, and it caught the dust motes in the air and made the space look, for a few minutes, genuinely beautiful in the way that only ruined beautiful things can be. I stopped at the balcony railing and looked out over the theater and felt the specific ache that hits me sometimes in buildings like this. Not quite sadness, not quite love, something that doesn't have a clean name but lives in the upper chest. It seated 900, I said, not really to her. Can you imagine what it sounded like? A full house, the orchestra warming up, silence from behind me. Then, acoustic tile was added in the 50s. It destroyed the original resonance. A pause. The 1932 season programs are in the municipal archives. I reviewed them when the property first came to us. I turned to look at her. She was standing a few feet back, not at the railing, arms loose at her sides. And for just a moment, one of those moments that comes and goes too fast to analyze, her face was different. Not open, exactly, but less closed, less conclusively sealed against whatever was outside it. You reviewed the programs, I said. Due diligence. Most people's due diligence doesn't include 1932 season programs. She met my eyes and said nothing, and I had the impression she was deciding how much of something she was willing to concede. The Alden hosted Ella Fitzgerald in 1938, she said finally. She was 19. It was one of her first major venue performances in the city. I looked back out over the theater. And you're going to tear it down. The silence that followed wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't hostile either. It was the silence of two people occupying the same space with a disagreement between them that neither had resolved and neither was willing to perform resolution about. I found I respected that, even as it frustrated me. My job, she said at last, is not sentiment. No, I agreed. Mine isn't either. I made a note on my clipboard, but I'm still going to tell you what I find, accurately. That, she said, is precisely what I'm paying you for. I didn't think about Vespera Street Claire that night. That's what I told myself while I spread my preliminary notes across my kitchen table and made pasta that I ate standing over the sink, looking out at the back of the building across the alley where someone's kitchen light was on, and two people were having what appeared to be an argument about something in a cabinet. I didn't think about her. I thought about the Alden, about the subfloor water damage in the northeast corner, the encouraging news about the proscenium arch's actual load capacity, the question of what was underneath the drop ceiling panels someone had installed in the mezzanine lobby, probably in the 1980s, when drop ceilings were considered progress. I thought about the programs from 1932 in the municipal archives. I thought about how a woman who intended to demolish a building had bothered to look those up. The next morning, I was at the Alden by 8, before the October light had finished committing to itself. I brought better equipment, a moisture meter, a better flashlight, the borescope camera I usually reserve for second visits, and I started in the mezzanine lobby. Because the drop ceiling had been bothering me since the day before, in the particular way that only architectural intuition can bother you, insistent and not fully explainable. I found what I expected to find, which is to say, I found something I hadn't expected at all. Beneath the suspended tile grid, behind a section of original wall that someone had partially enclosed with drywall sometime in the mid-century, was a corridor. It wasn't on any of the plans I'd been given. Not the original Ferris drawings, not the 1958 renovation permit, not the 1991 survey. Just a corridor, about 4 feet wide, running behind the mezzanine-level boxes along the theater's east wall. I followed it with my flashlight, which is either the behavior of someone with good professional instincts or the behavior of someone with no self-preservation. And I have been told by more than one person that the line between those two things, in my case, is thinner than ideal. The corridor ended in a door, and the door opened, its hinges protesting in the voice of something that had not been asked to move in decades, into a room. It was small, maybe 20 by 20, low ceiling. The walls were paneled in dark wood that had dried and contracted but was still, unmistakably, beautiful. Walnut, I thought, with inlaid patterns along the upper border that I recognized as the same geometric motif, repeated throughout the Alden's more prominent decorative elements. There was a fireplace, cold and blocked, with a surround of green and gold tile. A built-in bookcase along one wall, still holding a few books so furred with dust they were more idea than object. In the center, 2 armchairs facing each other, upholstered in what had once been green velvet and was now mostly ghost. A private salon. Not on any plans, not in any of the documentation. A room built for someone who wanted to watch the theater from above without being seen. A room built for conversation that wasn't meant to be overheard. I stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then I took out my phone and called the number I'd been given for Vespera St. Clair's direct line, which her assistant had included in the initial contract materials with the instruction, for site emergencies or significant findings, only she picked up on the second ring. Ms. Halloway. I found something, I said. In the mezzanine. You should see it. A pause. Today? If you can. Another pause, shorter. I'll be there at noon. She arrived at 12:03, which told me something. Not early, because that would have communicated eagerness, but not late in the way of people who use lateness to establish hierarchy. 12:03 was the arrival time of someone who had looked at their schedule and found the earliest available gap and taken it. I led her through the lobby, up the mezzanine stairs, and through the drop ceiling access I'd widened enough to navigate without turning sideways. She ducked through without commentary. I led her down the corridor. She held her own flashlight now. Small, efficient, clearly a good one. I pushed open the salon door. She stopped in the doorway and looked. I watched her look. That's the honest account. I stood slightly to the side and I watched her face, which had been composed in its usual way, measured, contained, giving nothing away without intention, and I watched something move through it. Not a dramatic shift, not a revelation, more like the surface of water when something moves beneath it. The change is real, but the depth remains unknown. This isn't on the plans, she said. No. Any of the plans? I checked. It isn't. She stepped into the room and crossed to the fireplace. Crouched, the way she'd crouched in the orchestra pit the day before, with the same matter-of-fact willingness to get close to the evidence. She examined the tile surround, ran one finger along the edge of a green tile without touching the surface directly, which told me she was thinking about conservation and hadn't decided not to. The tile is rookwood, she said. I blinked. How do you know that? My grandmother had a piece, a vase. She stood, looked at the bookcase, crossed to it, and tilted her head to read the spines that were still legible. These are theater programs, not municipal archive copies, original house copies, the ones printed for each performance. She reached out, stopped before touching one. There are dates on some of these. 1927, 1928. Opening season? I said. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. Someone used this room. Regularly, from the look of the chairs. She turned and looked at the pair of armchairs, and something in the way she looked at them, two chairs facing each other, set for conversation, for company, made me suddenly, inexplicably aware of something I didn't have words for yet. Someone built a room inside the theater that wasn't part of the official architecture. Someone wanted a private place to watch and to think. Emmett Ferris had a daughter, I said. I looked it up last night. Her name was Constance. She worked for him as a draftsman, which women weren't officially permitted to do at the time, so the records are inconsistent. But there are some letters in the Avery Library collection, I found a reference to them this morning, that mention her specifically in relation to the Alden. Vespera looked at me. You were in the library this morning? It opens at 9, I called ahead. I paused. The letters haven't been fully digitized. They're in the physical archive. I requested an appointment for Thursday. Something crossed her face. Not quite a smile, but in the family of expressions that precede a smile. You're very thorough for someone who's been hired to document deterioration. I'm thorough about everything. I met her eyes. The findings go in the report either way, but if there's a hidden room and it has a history, that history is part of the assessment. She looked back at the room, at the two chairs. Yes, she said, and her voice had shifted slightly. Still controlled, but by a fraction of a degree less so. I suppose it is. We sat in the two green velvet chairs. I want to be clear that this was not a romantic gesture or a sentimental one. It was practical. We both had materials to review, and the chairs were the only seating and the floor was not particularly inviting. We sat in Constance Ferris's hidden salon with our respective folders and Vespera's phone, through which she had pulled up several historical maps of the building's original footprint, and we worked. But there's something about working in a room like that. A room with its own silence, its own particular held breath, its own century of accumulated attention, that changes the quality of conversation. The professional distance that had structured our interaction the day before began, not to collapse, but to breathe, to develop small gaps through which something else could move. She asked about my background. Not as small talk. She didn't do small talk. I was already starting to understand that. But with the specific curiosity of someone forming a more complete picture of a person they've decided is worth understanding. I told her about the architecture degree, the preservation fellowship, the years at a firm in Boston before I'd come back to New York for reasons I summarized as, the work is better here, which was true, but incomplete in the way that most honest summaries are. You grew up in the city? She asked. The Bronx. My mother's still there. A pause. She thought I should be an engineer. More practical. I told her preservation architecture was practical. Is it? Marginally. I smiled. But it's the work I know how to do. She considered this. I grew up in this city as well. Different part. The kind of understatement that covers the distance between the Bronx and, I suspected, somewhere along the Upper East Side. My father was in the business, and his father before him. And your grandmother, I said. The one who restored the brownstones. A pause, slightly longer than her usual pauses. Eleanor? She said the name carefully, with the particular care that belongs to names we rarely speak aloud anymore. She was the one who built the company, in many ways. Not the capital. That came from my grandfather. But the understanding of what buildings actually are. That they're not just assets. She stopped. I thought she'd finished. Then. She died when I was 26. I was still learning things from her. The room held us both for a moment. I'm sorry, I said, and meant it simply, without qualification. It was a long time ago. The words were automatic, the kind you develop to redirect conversations that have gotten somewhere unexpected. But she didn't redirect it, not fully. She would have been interested in this room, she said, looking around. She liked finding things that weren't supposed to be there. I thought, and so do you. You reviewed the 1932 programs and you know Rookwood Tile by sight, and you came here this morning in 12 minutes because I told you I'd found something. You are more interested in this building than you want me to know. I didn't say any of this. I wrote a note in my folder about the salon's likely use, and the Rookwood Tile, and the need to cross-reference the Avery Library letters. But I filed the observation somewhere I knew I'd return to. The rest of the afternoon proceeded with a quality of suspended time that I associate with certain kinds of spaces: old libraries, churches between services, museums at closing. We worked through the salon systematically, cataloging what was present. The books, 18 identifiable, 6 beyond recovery. The tile, rookwood, green and gold, intact and restorable. The paneling, walnut veneer over plaster, with the inlaid geometric pattern I confirmed as a signature Ferris motif. A small desk that revealed itself when we moved one of the armchairs, its surface empty except for a single dried inkwell and what appeared to be a folded piece of drafting paper too fragile to open without proper conditions. That paper. I photographed it from multiple angles and marked it as a priority item for controlled archival handling. The texture was correct for the period. Rag content, good quality. The fold lines were crisp enough that I could see, at the edges, faint traces of pencil marks. Not numbers. Lines. Architectural lines. Someone drew something in here, I said, and kept it. Vespera looked over my shoulder at the photograph on my camera's screen. Close enough that I was aware of her. A quality of attention that has a physical dimension, a way of being near that she carried without, I thought, fully knowing she carried it. The scent of something clean and expensive. The slight sound of her breathing. Slower than mine. Steadier. You think it's a drawing of the room? She asked. I think it could be a drawing for the room. Like a personal sketch. Not an official plan. Something made for the pleasure of it. I lowered the camera. She built this for herself. Constance Ferris. She designed a room inside her father's building that wasn't on any official document, furnished it personally, and used it over the course of years. A silence. That's a significant conclusion from a folded piece of paper. It's a hypothesis, I acknowledged. That's what Thursday's archive visit is for. A pause. You could come. She looked at me, and for a moment I wasn't entirely sure what I'd said, or more precisely why I'd said it. The invitation had arrived before I'd completed the thought that preceded it. To the Avery Library, I clarified, for the Ferris letters. She said nothing for a moment. Then, I'll check my schedule. Which, I was beginning to understand, was Vesper Street Clare for yes, but I'm not ready to say yes directly yet. I left the Alden at 6, when the October dark had fully committed and the building had settled into a different kind of silence. Nighttime silence, which in an empty building has a more active quality than you'd expect. Full of small sounds that are just physics and wood and old metal and temperature change, but that your nervous system insists on treating as something more intentional. On the sidewalk, I stood for a moment and looked up at the Alden's facade. From the outside, you could see the damage more clearly, the missing sections of terracotta ornament, the boarded windows, the general air of a thing that has been left to manage alone for too long. But the bones were there, the chevron pattern above the entrance arch, the stylized eagle at the roofline, missing one wing but still regarding the street, with the serene conviction of something that knows it was made to last. Vespera's town car was still at the curb. I noticed it because it was hard not to notice. Long, dark, quietly expensive in the way of things that have nothing to prove. The driver was reading something. The car hadn't moved. She was still inside. I told myself this was not my business and walked toward the subway. I got half a block and stopped, and stood there for a moment with my canvas bag and my notes and my borescope camera in the last of the amber light that Manhattan does in October, and thought about a woman standing alone in a room full of someone else's century-old secrets, in a building she was planning to tear down. Then I kept walking. But I thought about it all the way home, and while I made tea I didn't really want, and while I sat with my notes spread around me and wrote up my preliminary findings in the professional, documented language of someone doing their job. I wrote about the Botticino marble, and the acoustic tile, and the mezzanine corridor and the salon. I wrote about the rookwood tile and the walnut paneling and the fragile folded paper. I didn't write what I was actually thinking, which was, something is wrong with the demolition plan, and not in the way I was originally hired to think about. The structural case is more complex than the original survey suggested. The historical significance case is now substantially more complex as well. And Vespera St. Clair knows her grandmother's name like a word she saves for serious occasions, and she stayed in that building after I left, alone with Constance Ferris's green velvet chairs, for reasons she will probably not explain to anyone. My report would be accurate. I'd promised her that, and I intended to keep it. But accurate, I was beginning to understand, was going to be more complicated than either of us had anticipated when she'd shaken my hand in the ruins of the center aisle that Tuesday morning. I fell asleep at my kitchen table with my notes, which is not the most professional end to a working day. And when I woke at 2 a.m. with a stiff neck and a glass of cold tea beside me, my first thought was about the folded architectural drawing and what it might show. My second thought, less professional, less easily filed, was about a gray-eyed woman sitting alone in a room that wasn't supposed to exist. Thursday came with the particular crispness that October reserves for its better days. Sky the color of good ceramic, air that made the city feel like it was made of edges. I was at the Avery Library on the Columbia campus by 9:15, sitting in the reading room with white cotton gloves and the 3 folders of Ferris family correspondence that the archivist had pulled for me. Vespera arrived at 9:29. She wore charcoal today, a different shade, warmer, and carried nothing except a slim leather notebook I hadn't seen before. She sat across from me, accepted a pair of cotton gloves from the archivist with a brief thank you that was genuinely gracious, which surprised me slightly, and opened the first folder with the careful attention of someone who has handled old paper before. We worked in silence for nearly an hour. The Avery reading room is designed for exactly this kind of work. Long wooden tables, good task lighting, a hush that is institutional and therefore comfortable rather than oppressive. Occasional sounds from other researchers. The soft percussion of gloved hands turning paper. I found the first reference to Constance in a letter dated April 1926, a year before the Alden opened. It was from Emmett Ferris to his business partner, a man named Roland Cross, and it discussed at length the interior detailing of the mezzanine level. Partway down the second page, Constance has proposed a modification to the box corridor, which I believe has real merit. A private room accessible from the East Passage for our own use and entertainment. She argues with sound logic that a theater owner should have a place from which to observe his house without being observed in return. I am inclined to agree. I have instructed her to proceed with the design, as her instincts in this matter are considerably better than mine. I slid the letter across the table without speaking. Vespera read it again, set it down with her hands flat on the table on either side of it, which was not a dramatic gesture but somehow had the quality of one. She designed it herself, Vespera said. Her father commissioned it, but she designed it. Yes. Silence. Then Vespera reached for the next letter in the sequence, and I watched her read through it with the focused attention of someone pursuing something they haven't named yet. We found 3 more references to Constance over the next hour. One that mentioned she had worked on the ornamental program for the lobby ceiling. Constance's sunburst design is exactly right. She has her mother's eye. One that referred to her by the professional title of draftsman that Emmett Ferris appeared to use without apparent awareness of its social irregularity. And one, the last one, dated 1931, that mentioned in passing that Constance had begun her Thursday practice of working from the theater on days when the house was dark. Thursdays. We were sitting in the Avery Library on a Thursday. I didn't say this out loud, but I looked up from the letter and found Vespera looking at me with the expression of someone who has made the same observation and found it worthy of acknowledgement. She came here on Thursdays, I said. To that room. A pause. To draw, presumably, and think. Alone. Probably. Vespera looked back down at the letter. She never married. There's a gap in the correspondence after 1933. The archivist mentioned the Depression-era letters were largely lost, but from the 1927 material, she appears to have been the most technically skilled member of the Ferris practice. She just couldn't be officially credited. I thought about a woman designing a room for herself inside her father's building, coming there on Thursdays, making drawings that weren't on any official plan, keeping programs from seasons that she'd watched from a private angle. The loneliness of that, and also the stubbornness of it. The refusal to disappear entirely from the work just because the work wouldn't officially admit her. She's the reason the room exists, I said. She's the reason half the best things in that building exist, and her name isn't in any of the public record. No. Vespera's voice was quiet. It isn't. I looked at her and found her face in one of those briefly less sealed configurations, looking at the letter in front of her with an expression I couldn't fully read, but felt somehow. A kind of recognition. Something that sat differently than the professional consideration she usually showed. She felt me looking and glanced up. I dropped my eyes to my notes. We stayed another 40 minutes, working through the remaining correspondence. By the time we'd finished, I had 8 pages of notes and 3 photographs of specific passages, and a conviction that had solidified from hypothesis to something close to certainty. Constance Ferris had designed the salon for herself and had used it as the primary site of her independent work for years, and the drawings that remained in that room, including whatever was folded in that small desk, were likely the most comprehensive record of her architectural thinking in existence, which meant the room was not a curiosity, it was an archive. On the steps of the library afterward, in the full October brightness, Vespera stopped and looked out at the campus and was silent for a moment. The kind of silence that is decision-making and not quite private. The report, she said finally. When you write up the salon, you'll include all of this. Everything I've verified. Yes. A pause. And the folded paper. It'll need professional archival handling before we can assess what it is. But yes, it'll be in the report. She nodded once. Then, unexpected. Thank you for calling me, when you found it. I looked at her, and for a moment I saw what I thought was the thing beneath the surface. The thing she moved through spaces as though hiding. The thing she'd kept behind the distance and the sarcasm and the deliberate footsteps in an abandoned theater. Not weakness. Something less containable than that. You would have wanted to know, I said. Simply. Yes, she said. I would have. She walked down the steps to where her car was waiting, and I stood in the October light on the Avery Library steps and watched her go, and thought about a building she intended to demolish, and a room inside it built by a woman whose name no one was supposed to remember, and 2 armchairs set facing each other for conversations that had never quite finished. My report would be accurate, but accuracy, it turns out, has a way of mattering.